Okay, everybody's clock say 7 o'clock. I think we'll get started. For those who don't know me, my name is Jocelyn Bell, and I'm the editor and publisher of Broadview magazine. Just wonderful to see so many faces, familiar ones and new ones. And thank you so much for taking an hour from your evening to be here with us. But behind the scenes with me, as you've often had before, is Sharon Doran, and she's our technical help in the background, and she'll be posting things in the chat as we go along. I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. And today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. Let us know where you're from in the chat. Please say hello from your hometown. If you're part of a community of faith and want to add that in as well, please do so. And if you have your own land acknowledgement that you'd like to share, please do so also in the chat. So let's feel free to say hello to one another in that space. You probably know that we are recording this session, and so that's so we can share the event with others. And if you are uncomfortable with your thumbnail video appearing in the video, just hit the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your screen. Please do turn on the chat function, and that's the way that we're going to use to ask questions for the most part. And it's in the bottom row, and you just click on it and the chat will appear probably on the right. I also recommend that you use speaker view rather than gallery view. That lets you focus on one person who's talking rather than everybody who's listening. And there's a spot to change that in the top right corner of your screen. So this evening, we're going to hear from Andy O'Neill, Sid Frankel, in conjunction with Josiah Neufeld and Sarah Bessey, all of whom contributed to the March 2024 issue of Broadview. One final note before we get started, and that is that after our speakers have told us a bit about themselves and their stories, there will be a time to ask questions. Sharon will post our instructions on how to ask questions in the chat space. And please do ask questions. It makes for a much more vibrant conversation if there are more participants in the conversation and lots of different viewpoints from across the country, not just my questions, although I do have some ready if anybody's feeling shy. So Sharon will post that in the instructions and we're ready to go. So our first speaker tonight is Andy O'Neill, and he is an assistant professor of pastoral theology at Atlantic School of Theology in Halifax, but he lives in Lower Cloverdale, New Brunswick. He served in congregational ministry for 15 years in the United Church of Canada and for 2 years in the Church of Scotland. Andy is also a volunteer board member for Broadview, and he will soon be stepping into the role of vice chair of the board. In our March 2024 issue, Andy wrote a short piece called "Go Ahead, Raise Your Voice," in which he argues that everyone who wants to sing should be allowed to do so, and no one should be told to mouth the words. So forgive the pun, but that statement struck a chord with many of our readers. And so it's a real pleasure to have Andy with us here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Andy.
Thanks very much, Jocelyn. So over the years, I had noticed that many of our students were uncomfortable with worship music or had limited experience with how to work with musicians in lifting up the music that already exists in every congregation. And in fact, this was something I had noticed among many of my colleagues in ministry over the years as well. So last summer, I offered a course for ministry candidates called The Congregation Song, and it was actually aimed at non-musicians who wanted to learn and experience the variety and power of liturgical music and Christian worship. Behind that curricular goal, though, lay my own anecdotal observation that thriving congregations almost always have thriving music programs. So including worship and faith formation, community building, wider community engagement, and so on. Because, I mean, to a certain extent, the small piece that I wrote for Broadview is a truism. Music brings people together. Churches are a natural place for that to happen, though. And it's something that I think we were probably many of us feeling more acutely during COVID, and now in this COVID-inflected time, how do we emerge as congregations in joy not only in sort of concern and consternation over some of the things that we're facing right now. I also knew something else, though, which was a little bit more personal, which I'd heard time and time again in a disappointing story that became very familiar from so many congregants and friends who at some point would share with me that they had been told, often at a young age, you can't sing, or could you please just mouth the words? In fact, both of my parents were told that when they were younger. And really sadly, the two places that this happened most often for those people were at school and at church. And so I realized that not only had I been very fortunate to have a musical upbringing, but that I'd kind of taken for granted what that means. That there were so many opportunities and so much joy that was available to me that was not, for the opportunities that were not and joy that was not available to so many others. And there are so many people in our congregations whose only opportunity to sing and to experience the joy of music is at church, right? But who at some point in their lives been silenced. So obviously that's a problem, not least for people going into ministry who will be responsible for leading public worship, but it's especially a problem for churches that are trying to find ways to engage not only in the wider community, but even their own members. So in the past few years, the landscape has shifted dramatically in our churches with respect to attendance, yes, but more importantly, with respect to volunteer energy. And so part of what I was asking was, where does that energy come from? And I see online here tonight at least one of my very early music teachers who was also at my church. I don't think that a strong music program is going to meet all of the church's concerns, but I have seen how many times a small music group, a youth band, a concert series, a fundraising show, or even just an anthem that's offered by someone who has been encouraged to offer their gift can bring life and joy to a congregation, and perhaps more importantly, to coin a phrase, a new voice, and with it, renewed optimism. It just two final things. I should be clear that my enthusiasm for music ministry, to make music a focus in ministry, is not something that I see as a growth strategy. What I would be focused on, and what I try to encourage students as well as colleagues to be focused on, is bringing the music out of the congregation that's already there. This is just part of our life of faith together, that speaking theologically, when we lift our voices and hearts in song, we are returning to God the song of creation that is already breathed into us, right? The carol, "It Came Upon a Midnight Clear," says it best, and the whole world sends back the song which now the angels sing. And my final comment, to have people in our congregations who have been robbed of music or silenced early in life is also the result of a view of worship that seeks perfection. And for a long time, I participated musically in weekly worship that aspired to perfection. And the result can be beautiful, transcendent even. What we lose, however, is the work that the Holy Spirit can be doing to draw out the music in others that's already there, that music that fosters a faithful joy that comes from participating in worship as opposed to simply being present. And that doesn't make different forms of worship bad or wrong. It can just make them a bit incomplete. If we're focused on trying to perfect something as opposed to bringing out the music that's in everyone, then we can lose out on something really valuable. I'll stop there, and I'm always happy, as you can probably tell, to say more, but I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy. That's really fascinating and also beautifully said. So really appreciate it.
Sure.
Um, just looking over at the comments, yeah, Gillian McLean says that she feels peace and joy when singing, which is a blessing. I think a lot of us can share in that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your own background. Like you mentioned that one of your early teachers is here. That's exciting.
Yeah.
And so how did you get started? What got you excited about spark this lifelong love of
Mhm.
singing in you?
Thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, the first person who helped me to find my singing voice was a woman named Vivian Hill She was the choir director at my church where I grew up, Woodlawn United in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. And she had two choirs at the time. One was the junior choir, so for all kids, and then she had an intermediate girls choir. She actually invited me to join the intermediate girls choir when I was 13. I declined. That was not a musical opportunity that I wanted to take up at that point in my life. Boy, I learned something about 2 years later, how great an opportunity that would have been. But anyway, um, I follow, my sister is older than I am by about 4 years. And so I watched her take piano lessons, voice lessons, flute, and so on. My way was to take lessons, yes, but also to verge into other forms of music. So I did clarinet and saxophone for many years in jazz band and stage band and so on, and choirs, which is actually the choir setting is where I met my wife Jenny, and it's probably some of the best adventures in life actually that I had were in choirs. So I have that classical training background, but also obviously bringing that to ministry. My focus couldn't be on what music was for me. It had to be on what it was for the congregation. So how do I bring that out for other people instead of intimidating them with my training, right? So it was, yeah, it's kind of a dance that way.
Mhm. Great. I wondered if you could weigh in on a controversy that comes up in some congregations, which is whether you should have the paid soloist to bring. I mean, you've talked a little bit about this perfection idea, but some people want the paid soloist, and some people want anybody who wants to sing a solo or be in the
Mhm.
choir should be allowed to do so. Where do you land on that spectrum?
Well, I think ministry is probably all about pleasing everyone all the time, right? That's what we're aiming for. No, it's a really good question because I think there are in congregations there is a kind of musical culture, and it can be it's one that can be fostered, and also one that can be challenged at times. I think it's good to challenge the musical culture of a congregation. So there are congregations that have this rich musical tradition of maybe not even always paid, but trained people to sort of offer music, as it were, on behalf of the congregation within worship, and that's wonderful. And then there are other congregations who have more of the sort of musicians lifted from within the congregation and offering what gifts they have. I think there will be a tendency in each congregation toward one or the other, maybe a tradition or a history. I guess my answer, which is kind of a non-answer, is it's always good to push back on that and to sort of see what could be. So, for example, in the congregation I served latterly, my wife and I are part of a professional choir here in Moncton, and we had them come as guests one week. So that was very clearly, sort of the paid soloist model. The congregation loved it. It was a gift to them. Our normal culture is to have people from within the congregation. So I think it's possible yeah, to enjoy the tradition that you have, but then also to offer the other gifts that exist.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Janice McGregor is commenting. She says, our church started a hymn sing once per month after the church service. Members grab a coffee and stay to sing many of the lovely hymns we don't have time to sing during the service. Make a joyful noise. Great
Absolutely.
idea.
That is such a great idea, Janice. I'm glad that someone mentioned this. Um, Ron Klusmeyer actually once gave me a similar idea, but essentially that um, there are in that whole uh, canon of hymns that we have, we often have a smaller canon that we're used to singing within the congregation, so we miss out on a lot. Hymn sings, hymn festivals occasionally, maybe once every year or so, are a great way to bring out all of that music that we don't always touch on. That's excellent.
Okay, and we've got Pamela Richardson asking, have you, Andy, or has anyone had experience with intergenerational choirs within a congregation? Something we have discussed at our church.
Mm. Um, since I have the open mic, I'll say yes. At my congregation, we have had. It doesn't happen all the time because it can be very very difficult to get people of different generations together to rehearse. And I should just put in a plug for the musicians in the crowd. It's so important to practice and rehearse. If you're going to do something together, to make a joyful noise, you have to run through it at least a couple of times, so that joy really comes out. It can be hard to bring people together, but sometimes it could be a focus for a season. So if you want to offer something maybe at the beginning of Lent, or maybe fourth Sunday of Advent, and you know it's coming up, what a great idea to involve people in there. There's a ton of repertoire out there for doing that.
Okay, great ideas. And Mary Leslie says our congregation of St. John's United in North Saanich has a Taizé service on a Friday evening and a jazz vespers on a Sunday evening monthly that are well attended, much more than our Sunday services by folks in the community. These musicians are talented, and jazz folks vary from month to month. Before COVID, we had a Metic Vespers also. It hasn't restarted yet. Oh, sorry, so I was supposed to say Celtic. Okay, I was like,
yeah.
Metic, that's new. No, she meant Celtic. There you go.
Though that's an excellent variety, and probably so Teze can include a lot of people with those repeated phrases. Jazz tends to be a little bit more difficult for people to kind of participate in, but can with really good musicians who are able to do that. That's so good to hear. Yeah, that's excellent.
Your piece in Broadview accompanied a larger piece about singing as social justice. I hope you've had a chance to read the larger piece too. I wondered if you had any reflections on the social justice elements of being part of a community of singers.
Absolutely. The specific example that I can think of is here in Halifax. There's a choir for new Canadians, and it helps people to not only, learn the language, which obviously is helpful to them, but it's to meet other people and to become part of a group. So it's working joyfully against that sort of isolation that so many people new to a country would feel, right? That's certainly one aspect, but the other that would be so important, and there's a whole conversation we could have about cultural appropriation and how not to do it, but how to share the music of other cultures in a really important way. So, for example, the music of the civil rights movement, there are lots of songs that just resonate with our heritage and faith. And I think when we do a good job of teaching the congregation where that music comes from and who the music is from and why and so on, at least on occasions, I've been encouraged to do that in order to share the music. That's an excellent way of not only raising awareness, but also sharing the gift that comes from raised awareness about the faith and also the voice of other peoples. So, yeah.
Yeah. You made the point that, the music is about, almost all congregations have thriving programs, but that you weren't saying music is the answer for growing the church. So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. And I also wondered if the type of music matters, because we often hear that, like, let's get more modern music and that will bring in the young people, right? So what are your thoughts about those things?
It's an excellent question, Jocelyn. All of these questions have been great. This gets at the heart of I think a question about what our public worship and what our witness is actually about. So if what we're doing is faithfully, if we're sharing our faith and doing so in song and in worship and in witness through our work in the wider community, I think that in and of itself, as it were, attracts people, or there is something that then people want to know more about. It can have its own sort of magnetism. If what we're trying to do instead, and this is that sort of growth strategy thing, is how do we get people to come into us? How do we get more members and so on? I feel like that's just it's sort of asking the wrong question. That if we are living out our faith in everything that we do, that will be, as it were, to put it crudely, sort of the best advertisement for that life that we're finding together in community. Also, I think, though, it's something that we see certainly in what we often call mission work or outreach, that many people will want to join in the good work that we're doing, before they even maybe have thought about what their specific belief system is or whatever. So it's that sort of belonging before believing, or behaving even before believing. So yeah, I would just say I would never want to see this as a growth strategy. I would want to see it as perhaps a faith growing strategy that then is kind of magnetic in its own way. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we are going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Andy. It's great to hear from you, and really excited that you're also going to step into the role starting in June as the vice chair of the Broadview board. That's awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to move along to Sid Frankel and Josiah Neufeld. Sorry. So Sid Frankel is a member of the National Steering Committee of Campaign 2000 to End Child Poverty, an organization that was featured in Josiah Neufeld's piece, It Takes a Village, about how the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, lifted thousands of children out of poverty during the pandemic, and asks why we couldn't continue to help them. Sid is also an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. Josiah Neufeld, the author of the feature, is also here and is an award-winning writer, and he's published books, and journalist and frequent contributor from Winnipeg. So in a slight change of format, Josiah is going to interview Sid, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So please join me in welcoming Josiah and Sid.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Sid Frankel. As Jocelyn mentioned, I'm a frequent contributor to Broadview, and for the March issue, I wrote a feature story about child poverty in Canada. I wrote about the efforts that have been made over the past few decades to eliminate child poverty, ever since 1989, when Parliament voted unanimously on a resolution to eliminate child poverty by, wait for it, the year 2000. So we're a little bit overdue, about 24 years overdue. We've made some progress during that time, but not enough. And the impetus for this story really came from a report that showed that child poverty went down during the pandemic, more dramatically than at any other point over the past few decades. And, you know, the questions that came out of that were, what happened? And more importantly, if we have the tools available to us to reduce child poverty that dramatically, why aren't we doing it? So these were some of the questions that I asked Dr. Frankel as I was researching this story. He's a professor at the University of Manitoba and one of the researchers who's been collecting data and analyzing public policy for Campaign 2000 ever since, I believe, 1992. Is that correct?
That is true.
Good. So the questions that I have are essentially the same questions I asked while I was researching this story, and I think his answers are quite revealing. So I'll just jump into it. Dr. Frankel, thanks for chatting with me. And you've been looking at the data on poverty in Canada and public policy for decades. And just give me give us all a brief overview. What have you seen in that time?
Okay. I'll jump off from the year 2000, the beginning of the century. And when we say child poverty, there are different definitions of what that is. So I'm going to tell you about the low income measure after tax, calculated from tax filer data. And two important things about that. One, it's the measure most strongly correlated with health outcomes and child development outcomes. And the tax filer data is not a perfect sample, but it's the closest thing we have to a survey. So in the year 2000, almost 1 in 4 Canadian children were living in poverty, 24.2%. And that had been quite typical of the 1990s, a little variation up and down, usually depending on economic factors. In 2016, it went down 5.4 percentage points to 19.6 when the Canada Child Benefit was introduced midway through that year. In 2017, it continued to go down to 18.6. 2020, what you were just talking about, Josiah, the pandemic benefits brought it down to 13.5%. the lowest since child poverty rates have been recorded in Canada. 2021, the latest data we have, we see child poverty starting to go up. So it's gone up to 15.6% from 13.5%. In 2021, most of the pandemic benefits were gone, but some were still in place. So all things being equal, we can expect further deterioration.
Wow, yeah, thank you. So I guess the question that I had when I was looking at this data, what did we learn about child poverty and government response from this experiment, as it were, maybe an inadvertent experiment on poverty reduction? It was meant to, the CERB was meant to help people cope with not working during the pandemic and such, but it became a kind of a test case.
Yeah. So one of the things I think we learned was that child poverty may not be that important to our governments because, as you say, this was a side effect. So in CERB and in the CRB, the Canada Recovery Benefit, we had a benefit not especially well designed or targeted to decrease child poverty. For example, if it was calculated on a family basis rather than an individual basis, it would have been better targeted to children. If the benefits were more slowly withdrawn as other income was earned, it would have even done a better job. But as it was, even this very imperfect instrument, which really wasn't meant for this purpose, made a real difference. One of the ways it made a difference, not the only way, but a major way it made a difference, is families with children where the parents were in low wage, precarious, unreliable work. They did much better on this benefit than they did earning those wages. So that is very clear evidence, if we needed it, that a lot of child poverty is created in the labor market, not necessarily by exclusion from the labor market through unemployment. I'd say those are major lessons we've learned.
And what would happen if we took those lessons to heart? We as Canada, I suppose more specifically our governments, federal and provincial governments. What could happen?
Well, I think we would make some improvements that would continue to make this difference. For example, we could improve the Canada Child Benefit. So it hasn't had an increase since except for inflation or inflationary increases since its original inception. The Canada Centre on Policy Alternatives have recommended a supplement for families living in poverty. Families earning less than $19,000 would get, for example, an additional $8,500 for the first child. That would have a major effect. There are some children who are Canadian citizens who are not eligible for the Canada Child Benefit. Many of them are living in poverty. They're ineligible because their parents are in precarious immigration kind of statuses. So one lesson is if we really use that Canada Child Benefit, it made a difference in the past and it could make a difference now. The other thing is it's very clear that we need good policy focusing on the labor market. We need to increase the supply of good jobs that pay well. I would argue we need to think not only about minimum wages, we need to think about a regulated living wage. I think those two things would make a tremendous difference. And of course, we have to think about the costs of austerity as governments start or continue to worry about paying for the pandemic benefits. This is often put in rather neutral terms that we've got to pay down our debt. Well, there is a big price to paying down that debt for children.
Yeah, those are some pretty essential things that we could be doing. I guess the question that maybe a lot of people might have when they see a story like this, or the question that I sometimes have is poverty an inevitable feature of our society? Is it something we just have to accept and live with, or is it something we could actually eliminate?
We could eliminate it. Other countries have come very close to eliminating it. Internationally, Canada falls in about the middle of the OECD distribution. The Nordic countries have done much better and have rates of around 2 and 3 and 4%. I'd say what is inevitable is that a capitalist economic system does produce poverty. It produces poverty and inequality. And that means two things. That means that there needs to be intervention in the economy by government. And that's as old as Keynes, if not older. But it also means that we need a welfare state. We need publicly provided income supports. They're not a luxury. They're absolutely necessary because of an economic system that benefits many, but also puts many into a position of poverty.
Well, I guess my next story is going to have to be on what a post-capitalist society would look like.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that.
All right. Well, sounds like we've got some future conversations. Jocelyn, do we have time for another question, or should we open it up to the audience? Where are we at with time?
I think we should open to the audience for a few minutes of questions. And do you want to lead that part? We didn't really. There's Helen's got a question. If you want to jump in, I'll just leave. You're doing a great job, Josiah. So I'm going to let you keep going.
Sure. It looks like okay. So we've got Helen Arnott with a question. Helen says, "Is the fact that the Nordic countries have done better to alleviate child poverty a function of the size of those countries?"
Not really. It's a function of a much better system of state supports, both income supports and services. And even though there's been deterioration in those countries over the last couple of decades, they're still far ahead of us. So there are much more robust supports for new parents in those countries, both in terms of leaves and services and income replacement. There's, even with the improvements we've seen recently, there's a much more comprehensive childcare system that is much lower cost for the families. So generally, we can point by and large at the welfare state.
Yeah, thank you. I see someone's got Helen, do you have your hand up? Follow-up question?
No. I have a question.
No. Okay.
Sorry, the counter argument I've heard to your response to my question, Dr. Frankel, is related to the increase of taxes that the Nordic countries have. And I don't know that our people in Canada would tolerate an increase of tax.
Well, it's useful to look at where we're at in terms of taxation. So, for example, we have a much less progressive personal income tax system than we once did. As you may remember, far fewer brackets, far more tax expenditures, write-offs that benefit not the poor, but the affluent. So I wouldn't say we need to start off by thinking about across-the-board increases in taxation rates. I think we need to think about restructuring. Way back in the 60s, the Carter Commission recommended that, and the Pearson government was the first not to respond. We've also had our corporate taxation rates lowered several times, and they're now quite significantly below the OECD average, and there's probably room to increase those. especially when we look at corporations that have had windfall profits in the pandemic and after the pandemic in this inflationary period. Dealing with poverty means redistribution. And you're right, it will be unpopular in some quarters, but I think that we need a nuanced approach, raising taxes for those who can afford it and for profitable corporations that can't afford it. It just can't come free.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Jocelyn, did you have a question?
I think I'm going to defer to Sam Lee, who's just come in here. It says, if changes are to be made through enhanced community responsibility and voting, how would you increase inclusive discourse and effective knowledge translation? Many young individuals do not know about the topics you covered unless personally interested.
Yeah, you're perfectly right. Poverty, and especially child poverty, is a kind of hidden problem. So if you ask the average Canadian in the year 2000, how many kids in Canada are poor, I don't think they would have said almost 1 in 4. So I think it's a matter of doing two things. One is there are some myths out there about the poor and about poor children, and organizations like Campaign 2000 are trying to bring information to bust those myths. Secondly, Campaign 2000 and other organizations put out information on child poverty, which I think is useful. And I think organizations need to become far more active in hosting community conversations. And of course, historically in Canada, the United Church has been very important that way, or the churches of the social gospel, which eventually became the United Church, really did have a lot to do with forming the right attitudes about poverty in Canada.
I'd love to hear a bit more about that, Dr. Frankel. If the involvement, that you just said they did have, do you still see them continuing with that work? And what more should?
Well, I'm certainly no expert, and I'm not a member of the United Church or even a Christian, but I do see, for example, the United Church doing very excellent work on advocating for a basic income in Canada, which is one solution that could be very important in alleviating child poverty.
Yep, there's definitely been a lot of discussion about that, and we've covered it as well and continue to do so.
Oh, great.
We have one from Gabe Bose. I have read that many other areas have reduced costs when all people receive a livable wage. Will that not offset the initial costs? Areas such as education, medical, policing, etc.
You're perfectly right. We have strong evidence that what's usually called a basic income does increase educational outcomes and does lower healthcare costs. The problem is that the costs occur immediately, that government has to begin paying on day one for a livable income, for a basic income. And the cost savings are in the midterm, and some of them even in the long term. For example, some health outcomes, improved health outcomes won't become apparent for a decade, kind of thing. And as you know as well as I do, that governments are worried about the next election. And that's one of the prime dilemmas in terms of the savings. There is strong evidence that the savings occur. The problem is when they occur relative to the cost. So the horizon is too long for many governments.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, Dr. Frank, we're going to have to leave it there. There are a couple of the questions that we didn't get to in the chat, and feel free to answer them. I also want you to know that Campaign 2000 was the inspiration for Josiah's piece, because somebody told me about it. I went to your website, I
great.
read about it, and then I said, this is a great piece for Josiah. So that's how it happened. So your group was the reason that we've covered.
Terrific. And I I sent Sharon the link to the last child poverty report update.
Posted that there. Yeah, that's
great.
Wonderful. Great.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we're going to change topics again to talk to Sarah Bessey. And Sarah is a Calgary-based best-selling author and co-founder of Evolving Faith, which is a community of people reimagining their faith. Her latest book is Field Notes for the Wilderness, Practices for an Evolving Faith. In our March issue, Sarah wrote Easter Moments, an essay about embracing the resurrections of everyday life. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Bessey.
Hey, everybody. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you all, checking in from the prairies as well. So I'm glad we had some Winnipeg folks here. I'm in Calgary on the Treaty 7 and also Métis people of region, Alberta Region 3. And I am really honored to be here. It has been an absolute joy to work with Broadview and to become part of the community that exists here. Jocelyn, it's been an absolute joy. So I wanted to, in this article, take a run at, well, first of all, it's always interesting writing about Easter when it's still Advent at the time, so it's a bit of a shift. And given my work with a lot of folks over the last 10 or 15 years with people of all different generations who are undergoing a bit of a faith shift, a lot of language around it might be things like deconstruction. I tend to use the phrase evolving faith mainly because it lets me bring along some of the things that I still love and want to hang on to while still releasing some of the things that maybe need to be released and some of which should probably sink to the bottom of the sea. And so I wanted to take a run at how I have rethought the implications of resurrection in my own life, and almost kind of widen that lens a bit. I think maybe sometimes there's almost a bit of a reaction, or sometimes there can be a bit of an overcorrection, perhaps. And as someone who came up in the charismatic revival movements of the 80s and even into the 90s, and had a lot of my faith formation, my initial faith formation kind of formed by these big, grandiose, notions and ideas about God and about revival and about what that means, usually not hugely connected to things like what we just heard about, like actual child poverty. So there was a lot more fun, with dueling tambourines in the room. And yet there were like a lot of gifts to that. And I think that one of them was some of the things that led to the article itself and the direction I ended up wanting to go with this. And a lot of it centered around learning a little bit more about that Greek word anastasis, which is usually used for the resurrection of Jesus. It's kind of this physical sort of noun to me because it meant like rising up or standing up even, or raising up. And after that sense of collapse or falling, and even the sense of disorientation that so many of us have had in the midst of a faith shift or a change in our faith understandings, even some loss that we've experienced within our lives, there's this sense of like, okay, we've got life out of death. We've got water in the desert. We can find hope in the midst of grief. And so beginning to see these multitude of resurrections that are almost kind of like hiding in plain sight in my life, and I think in your life as well. I think in the lives of all of, 70 of us here who are all kind of clocked in, it can be, and it can include, I think, a lot of the things that maybe I initially understood about revival and these big, demonstrations that were such a big part of my life. But it also can be outside of that or bigger than that, even by getting a lot smaller. And so one of the things that I deal with a lot in a lot of the conversations that I have, whether it's in mainline denominations or in non-denominational settings or people who have completely, been grappling with a lot of these things along the way, is there can be some hand-wringing about deconstruction. There can be almost some fear about these seasons of life that can lead to doubt and questioning, critical thinking. And of course, given the nature of my work, I think that that actually serves us really well. And I think a lot of us, if we've lived longer than a hot second, know that it also serves our churches and it serves our communities and it serves our country even really well. It's, so far from this act of faithlessness. Oftentimes we find ourselves there because of our faith, right? That we were the ones who were like, well, this has to matter in my actual living life, in how I show up for, children in my community, how I show up, whether it's climate change or whether it's politics or whether it's, global issues, but also for my neighbor next door. And when you run out of road and you run out of answers that aren't working and your prayers aren't being answered the way you thought they were, or you peek behind the curtain sometimes in a lot of church settings, rather than walking away entirely, which I think honestly sometimes can be a good and wise call, whether for a season or for a long time, there's this invitation to kind of dig in, and wrestle with God. And I love the courage of that. I think it takes a lot of ordinary stubbornness, to hold on, to ask for companionship in that sort of wilderness. And so that shift to seeing, everyday resurrections kind of reframed things for me and almost became a pathway. And so I released a new book a couple weeks ago, and in there I had this chapter about like the sacramental practice of being a noticer. And to me, it was really rooted in this article as well, because it felt like a lot of the religious experiences that I have had have been a lot of concern with like almost systematizing theology, and answering questions that are very easily memorizable, and making God really small and knowable, like creating this God that we can kind of regulate and keep in a box, right? And so a lot of theology that I study of theology and experience of theology and even church things became almost like this way to stop conversation rather than open it up. And yet there's so many like weird, wonderful stories that we've kind of almost tamed over the years, not just in scripture, although there's a lot of weird stories in there that the older I get, the more I love like the weirder ones, fishing with money in their mouth and widows with oil to sell. And, even things like the resurrection stories about, the dead rising. And I think allowing ourselves to finally ask some of those questions or widen that lens can be an act of love. There's a lot of uncelebrated humility in admitting that we don't know things, and in steering into the things that leave us asking questions instead of memorizing answers. And so with this piece and with this shift in how I viewed resurrection, I was wanting to kind of almost extend that invitation of like, how is God beckoning in the invitation of your life as it stands right now? Like if we aren't giving into that pressure to kind of domesticate these wild and unknowable possibilities of God and of the world, and even within our own soul. So I think that my hope was that we would make some room for fascination and amazement, that it could almost heal something in our minds and our hearts, to reopen some old doors that maybe we'd sealed shut with religious certainty and like these boundary markers, or here's what counts and here's what doesn't, here's what's in and here's who's out. And it turned out there was like this whole world of resurrection almost kind of waiting outside. And so I think that's why I ended up even just having some fun in the article of just kind of noticing some of these like small, ordinary resurrections that I don't really want to miss anymore.
Yeah.
And wanting to carve out some of that space where people who have maybe had some sort of deconstruction experience, or have maybe a sense of even exhaustion with religion right now, have an opportunity to kind of reclaim wonder and even noticing these moments and invitations in our life, when maybe we've lost some of the language that we used to have for God. It can almost open up new pathways, or maybe give us a path on older and more ancient roads as well. So that's kind of where that ended up coming from. And those were some of the things that were on the, I guess, in my mind as I was kind of taking a run at it. So yeah, that's, I guess, all I wanted to say right now. And Jocelyn, I know you had a couple of questions, and hopefully a few other folks do too.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and I loved working on this piece with you. And it, made me think about my own journey. As you know, I mean, I was born and raised in the United Church, but that doesn't mean I don't have a few things to deconstruct along the way as well. Absolutely. So we've got Janice. She says, I loved your concept of small, ordinary resurrections and recognizing the invitation to experience new birth. Absolutely. And, you know, I wonder if, while people are thinking about this, if there's, you know, Sarah gave us so many beautiful examples in her piece about the kind of resurrections that she's noticing. And so many of those resonated with me, and, you know, the first flowers of spring and the early dawn light and all of those things. And I wonder if people just want to share a moment of resurrection that they've experienced recently in their own life in the comments, if that's something that inspires people.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah, I'd love to read some of those too.
I like eavesdropping on other people's conversations with God.
Yeah.
That's always nice.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that you talked about was the hand wringing about critical thinking and deconstruction. And you know, I think in the United Church, a lot of people, and not everybody here is from the United Church, but many of us are, and I think we take a lot of pride in, you know, we're the critical thinking church. And I don't know if you've worked with you know, lots of mainline people in your work with Evolving Faith, but is that fair? Are we the critical thinking bunch, or is there still stuff there?
I think it's probably a little bit of both, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and those of you who have logged some miles or kilometers here in the United Church would be able to answer that probably a lot better. I know that a lot of folks like myself who, I think it's a familiar story for a lot of us, where it wasn't even my parents' generation who maybe stepped away from church. It was my grandparents' generation. And so in a lot of ways, I have been almost surprised sometimes by how many folks from the United Church and from other mainline denominations that often, I think, have found themselves kind of moving, you know, in a different direction than a lot of non-denominational or evangelical spaces. It initially surprised me how many of them found a home in a lot of these conversations. And I think because there is oftentimes things that we need to learn from each other.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of things that that come inherently as a gift of, I think, growing up and being, or even in adulthood and being formed deeply within the tenets and the values and the communities of the United Church, that can be a huge gift to a lot of deconstructed folks, and even provide communities where they've maybe experienced a lot of loss of belonging and a loss of that sense of family or of friendship, or even just co-disciples, right? Of figuring this thing out together. And then on the flip side, I also hear from a lot of folks that they, you know, are excited to learn from and be part of and be in community with folks who have different experiences, like myself, more happy, clappy, you know, Regina Leisure Center, where church smells more like the pool than it does like incense. And so there's, I think, a lot of room for all of us to be able to almost connect over those things, where maybe the things that we're deconstructing or rethinking are different, but we land in these spaces and say, you know what, I'm learning a lot from you. And I'm understanding even that my understanding of religion is one lane of it. That when I think that's one of the things, I mean, I know that maybe I'm getting off topic a little bit, but I think that's one of the things that I've often found really interesting is how often when we are in these conversations or we're walking alongside of folks, how often they say, well, I thought I was rejecting Christianity, but it turns out I was rejecting like this particular version of it it turns out is such a small slice of the pie.
Yeah.
And I think that when people encounter communities like the United Church, or people in the United Church encounter other communities, it's almost like this sense of like, oh, it's a lot bigger family than we thought. And there's a lot more room than we knew. And there's a lot of difference of opinion and a lot of different ways to show up in these spaces. And so even that I find a lot of hope from.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I want to ask, you mentioned a little bit about your book, but I'd love to hear more about what it's about and who is it for, who should read it?
Well, everybody on this call. No. Yeah, so the book is called Field Notes for the Wilderness, Practices for an Evolving Faith. And it was me basically taking these last, 12 or 15 years of work and kind of gathering it all up and saying, okay, what are the practices? What are the things when someone finds themselves almost at that threshold to the wilderness or at the beginning stages of rethinking their faith? What are the things that, first of all, I learned the hard way? that I'd like to be able to spare a few people from. And then also, what are the things that I would like to kind of tuck in someone's back pocket? And I think some of that maybe even comes from being, so close to the Rockies. And of course, we spend a lot of time in the mountains. You have a lot of informal field guides that are just kind of like, well, here's this path and here's a ditch to watch out for. But also, there's this sense of like, don't miss what's beautiful either. Or it's worth taking a side detour here in order to see something that's lovely, or to have a space for quiet and a place to catch your breath. And so I think that formed a lot of how I came into the book, was to say, okay, here's what has served me, and I hope it serves you well. But also there's a lot of room to wander, and even that sense of permission, and maybe even a little bit of dispelling some of the fear for folks. But it was definitely more of a, okay, it's a hopeful answer to what now is, I think, what I was going for.
Yeah. Well, check out the book, everybody, and also check out Evolving Faith, which is the organization that Sarah co-founded. I went to their conference virtually when was that? In November or October?
October,
Anyway,
actually. Wow.
yeah,
Feels,
yeah. And it was such an interesting mix of people from across North America who were preaching. It also included our own United Church moderator, Carmen Lansdowne.
Who I trade a lot of memes with now.
Yeah, right,
and she's a joy.
Yes, yeah, it was just a really interesting group, and yeah, very exciting organization. So check that out too. We need to wrap up, so this brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and especially to Andy and Sid and Josiah and Sarah, all of whom volunteered their time to make this event possible. So we're really, really grateful to all four of you. Tomorrow we'll be sending the attendees a short survey by email, so you can share your thoughts with us about the event. And our online reading club is free. However, it does cost us about $3,000 per year for the Zoom plan that can handle a big group. So if you're already a donor to Broadview, thank you so much. Your donations help us continue to feature exceptional writers and journalists, and to showcase their fascinating work at events like this. If you're not a donor, please consider making a donation for tonight's event. Sharon will post the link, and she just has. Thank you very much, Sharon. And that's also going to be available in tomorrow's survey. Sometimes we stay for a coffee, but I need to be on my way this evening, so I'm going to end us tonight. It's just been great to see everybody, and I hope that you can join us again next time on April 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern, when Alana Mitchell will talk about our April-May issue. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.